Hi, and welcome to another episode of Musings. My name is Amrita Ghosh, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today Dr. Sonora Jha, who has just come out with an incredibly important book, How to Raise a Feminist Son: Motherhood, Masculinity, and the Making of My Family, by Sasquatch Books in the US and Penguin Books in India. And I believe that just came out yesterday. I'm going to begin with an introduction to Dr. Sonora Jha. Sonora is an essayist, novelist, researcher, and a professor of journalism at Seattle University. She's the author of the novel Foreign and the memoir, How to Raise a Feminist Son. Foreign was a finalist for the Hindu Prize for Literary Fiction and the Shakti Bhatt First Book Award for the was longlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. Dr. Jha's op-eds and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Seattle Times, The Establishment, Dame, and in several anthologies. She grew up in Mumbai and has been chief of Metropolitan Bureau for the Times of India and contributing editor for East Magazine in Singapore. Apart from her university teaching, she teaches fiction and essay writing for Hugo House, Hedgebrook Writers Retreat, Seattle Public Library, and creative nonfiction. A warm welcome to you, Sonora.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Amrita. This is lovely.
So I'm going to begin with what really affected me in the book. I laughed. I almost joked at some parts. I cried. I related to the book in ways that I perhaps cannot express here. My favorite part, though, was the prologue, How I Raised a Feminist in the Dark. And you talked about the movies and how it created a space for you to guide your son into this fascinating journey of rethinking patriarchal structures. It led me to also remember watching specific films with my son and the conversations that followed. In this section of the prologue, you mentioned, and I'm going to quote you here, quote, he witnessed the movies and he witnessed his mama's female spectatorship at the movies, end quote. You also later in the same section talk about women characters, actors, auteurs, and spectators that are erased in real life. Could you talk more about what role female spectatorship plays in not just raising feminist boys and girls, but also how does it create a subversive space in critically rethinking these normative gender structures?
That's a lovely question. And I'm so glad that that chapter resonated with you because, it's such a pleasurable thing to watch movies with our boys. And I didn't know it as we were doing it, but that it was such a huge part of this enterprise of raising a feminist son. And it was one of the more pleasurable parts of it. So I think in terms of female spectatorship, for one, they get to see their mothers or the women in their lives taking just sheer joy and pleasure in the movies, in something that's a cultural product, that's a space even, like especially going to the movies, to claim that space, especially in places where public space is not meant for women. So I think back to my childhood where women, it would be such an outing for a lot of more conservative families where women were not necessarily allowed to go out of the home or be very independent in the spaces that they claimed public space, but they could go to the movies and they would go with their children and their families, and it would be considered a family film or a family-friendly film, right? And they would dress up and it would just be such a pleasurable act, right? Just such a sense of fun around it. And then, of course, Bollywood itself becoming this cultural product and this and becoming a part of culture where the dance and the singing and the dancing and the clothes and all of that becomes such a sight of pleasure and joy, especially for women. So much so that when the songs would come on, we would see men in the audiences rise and go outside for a smoke or go to the bathroom or something, but the women would be transfixed because it's about the songs and dance, right? So even thinking about taking joy in the spectatorship, I think that is a very central thing for boys to watch their women claiming this space. The other thing is, of course, the films themselves and the tropes in these films and in Bollywood films that we've grown up with are so problematic, right? So then that becomes an avenue for conversation. That becomes the space of like, while I am enjoying this as a fan, I can also be a critic, right? So there's this concept of the critic and the rasik. So the rasik is the person who's taking the ras or the joy out of it, but the critic is the one that is also having a critical appreciation of cinema, right? So I was a student of film studies, and I brought that kind of understanding of film into casual conversations, right? And my son would want that. We weren't just idle spectators at the movies, but for him to get that knowledge from his mother and say, okay, this is problematic. I don't see why the women are represented in this way. Why aren't there enough display of men's bodies in theaters, in movies, for my female spectatorship, right? My heterosexual gaze, right? So there was all of that. And then, of course, I started to introduce, as he grew older, to some of my favorite feminist films, like Mirch Masala. I remember he was about 9 or 10, and I'd gotten the video cassette of Mirch Masala from years ago with Smita Patel and Deepthi Nawal and all this. And this is a hugely feminist film and very cathartic. So for him to watch that catharsis, for his mother to see the avenging and the slow transformation of a village, an Indian village, to stand in a feminist solidarity with women was just amazing, right? Like to see that, to watch me feeling the sense of like, yes, this is great, right? And it became one of his favorite films. And then recently we went to see, like a couple of years ago when he came home from college, we went to see 8th Grade, where he and I both felt very uncomfortable. There's this one scene where the girl is being sort of pushed a little bit by a college boy or an older boy into being sexual with him, to experimenting, and she's uncomfortable, and we were squirming, and we were just feeling so sad. So for him to recognize that moment is, is a moment that a lot of girls in high school may be going through, right? For him to recognize. So it became sort of this interplay of the spectatorship side by side, sitting together and watching either failures of, in terms of examples of feminism in films, or successes.
I want to go back to something you said, and it really struck me while reading the book also. Right now, you said that public spaces are not for women, and we know that, all along, we've been taught that. And this goes back to chapter 2 of your book, which is titled, "What If I'm Not a Good Feminist?" I was really gripped by this incident that you talked about, your showering in bathing enclosures made for men who visit the Kumbh Mela procession. You state in that chapter, and I'm quoting again the same statement, "All public spaces in India are made for men," end quote. It's really this enormous realization that hits, and you were in your early 20s. I was curious that with this realization, was it an affect of shame that you felt in the moment? Or was it fear? You mentioned in that same moment, you fought back tears and decided not to leave home again. Could you tell us a little more about the significance of this incident that in your life as an evolving feminist?
Yeah, so I remember, if I think back to what I felt at that time, it was a whole cocktail of emotions. It was fear, first of all, because we had so little communication. I didn't have a pager or a cell phone to call home and to hear a familiar voice. I'm on assignment as a reporter, and everyone else around me is a man. And we're, and I'm at this railway station, and I feel like so many things could happen, and I'm hot. So I'm 23 years old, and I just want to be able to pour cold water on myself, and to recognize that, oh my goodness, I'm a woman, a young woman doing this, and this is not okay. I don't have my family around me. Not that that is a protection, right? Like, not that a family can necessarily be great at protecting you. But I also felt the burden of expectation, because I was there as a journalist on an assignment, right? And I've been told by my editor to be bold and take up space and to, get the story. And so I'm feeling that burden of expectation from my editor, who has such hopes in me and thinks I'm a good journalist. And then there's also that complication that, in being here, am I taking away a job from a man? Back then, that's what, people thought, oh, you're just here as a hobby, and then you'll get married and you'll no longer be in a public space. You'll, go and follow your husband around and all of that. So it felt like, am I meant to be here? Am I meant to be in this job, in this place, on this assignment? And clearly, the fact that I'm such a spectacle for all the people here on this railway platform means that I don't belong here, right? And then also seeing in that moment that even though the space was somehow not mine and I didn't want to leave home, I wanted to rush home and just like close myself and never have to leave. Home itself was treacherous. When home becomes treacherous, whether you're talking about your family home or you're talking about your country, your city, your marital home, anything, where you're not feeling the best of yourself, then you get compelled to lean back into that sense of like, yes, I was afraid on that railway platform, but at the same time, oh my God, how wide the world is, and how I feel this call to explore it with, right? And again, I wasn't being ambitious really, and not that there's anything wrong with it when I'm speaking specifically to the way I was conditioned, or even though I was to be in a career, my desire was like, just get married and be in this amazing suite, or, like be ensconced in these roles. And maybe, of course, you'll have a career on the side kind of a thing. But way leads on to way, right? And of course, I did leave home. And of course, I took the difficult path, or the road not taken, or the road less traveled, or whatever we want, whichever piece of literary work we want to go down. But I felt like with each departure, and feminism, as I say, is a departure upon departure, right? Like you keep walking away from certain things and going into a different sense of home, a different space, a different sense of public space, and claiming it, And then recently I was looking at these pictures of the Kumbh Mela and all these men during COVID time. If you've seen those photographs of all the swaths and miles of men, right? In a time of COVID, being still leaning into religion and all of that, and endangering other people. And it's such a sight to look upon and see that the danger, and I'm not saying all men are dangerous, but I'm saying like this sense of entitlement of public space in a time when it is not good for humanity to be taking up that public space. And there I was saying, I don't want to take up this public space. I don't want to take up space in a man's world. But even a pandemic doesn't stop these men from taking up that space.
No, absolutely. And I want to go back to what you said about feminism as departure. And chapter 2 is titled, What If I'm Not a Good Feminist? And I remember the lines, and I'm again quoting you here: good feminism feels good, even if mostly just in the head, ineloquent and incomplete. Bad feminism is like the suit that's curled into the cuticles of our toes. But if we see it, we know it will one day come out in the wash, and watching it run down the drain will feel so good, end quote. So beautiful. But going back to the title, is there a good and bad feminist then?
Sometimes I feel like labeling some people bad feminists and just say like, oh no, that's terrible. But there are strong feminist moments for all of us, and just terrible moments for all of us, right? And that's what I wanted to address, because sure enough, like when someone heard of the book recently, there was someone that tweeted at me and said, oh gosh, I feel like I want this book, but I don't think I'm a good enough feminist and that I know enough about feminism to take this book and raise my son as a feminist. And I said, chapter 2 is meant for you. And just trust me, like none of us knows whether we're good feminists or bad feminists. But so no one gets to define, right? There are moments of questioning. And in the moments of questioning is where we are committing ourselves to feminism, right? So no one gets to have this sort of definition of feminism as a straight jacketed set of actions that check this, this list and you'll be a good feminist. But really feminism is about questioning where your conditioning intersects with your comforts, right? Where you are holding on to something because it's comfortable and that you've been conditioned into it, but pushing past it will be uncomfortable, and yet it is liberating, right? So we're talking about liberation, and we're talking about something where a bad feminist is definitely someone who is minimizing the humanity of women, of people of color, of LGBTQ people, of people with disabilities. If you are minimizing someone's right to be completely claiming humanity and their right to space, to jobs, to love, to the highest office of the land, etc., then yes, you are a bad feminist, because feminist is about those values, right? And so, which doesn't mean that you give up or you sign off or you say, okay, then I'm just embracing this. But it's in that moment of questioning that, you seize upon that as an opportunity and examine where is it coming from. So of course, we have a lot of people who will say, well, it shouldn't be about an ism. It should not be, that is teaching feminism to your son is oppressive and is another kind of torture. Trust me, I'm getting a lot of phone calls and comments about these kinds of things these days. And the problem is, I think what you need to examine is, why are you saying that? Why are you saying that young men should not lean into fighting for the complete humanity of half of humankind? Why do you think it is not their business? And why do you think it is oppressive to them? Because feminism really is also letting my son claim his sweetness and his tenderness and not buy into this toxic male culture of being stoic or being aloof or, not interested in connection with, say, either his mother or beyond, to other people, and even with his friends, or buy into some sort of bro culture or whatever. That's it's a problem. It's a problem for them. So in a way, you're responding to the gentleness of boys and saying, yeah, hold on to it, and if we are not dismissing or opposing or frowning upon womanhood, then we are saying you can claim parts of that, or what is seen or conditioned as womanhood, into your own way of living as well. We're saying it's a gift. It's a gift. So bad feminism is definitely something that is denying that to our boys, and is denying a full humanity to women. And there are ways out of that bad feminism. I urge you to find that way out. Can I also add, sorry, there's also, the concept of feminism is not defined by any one person. So, what is bad feminism? If someone decides to stay in a bad marriage and not get divorced, is that bad feminism? No. And, feminists have existed long before anyone heard of that word. And does a white woman's feminism lend itself to my issues as a feminist of color? No. And does it necessarily work for the full humanity of my boy of color? No. So, I'm going to construct and reconstruct and reevaluate feminism and say, well, certain aspects of white feminism are bad feminism for me because they don't fit with me. So go ahead, fight in your own way, but also realize you might not be fighting for all of us. Right. So then that becomes bad feminism. It's still feminism.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to two concepts in your book, Motherhood and Mothering. Your book was published in US and in India recently. Which mother does the book speak to? If you felt that there were any differences or are any differences in positionalities in both motherhoods. And were there times you related to being an American mother or an Indian mother first?
That's a great question. And, I would say it's so difficult to track that, right? But in some ways, the process of writing a collection of essays as memoir is tracking. And so when I think back, I did distance myself from some aspects or some parts of Indian/Hindu/Brahminical culture that were problematic, right? That were limiting my full humanity as a woman. And there were some aspects of American culture that I could not appreciate and could not embrace, right? And some that I wouldn't know of. But I was raising my boy from the age of 6 onwards. He lived in America, so that his formative years were a very American boyhood with American kids around him. Because I was a single mom, I wasn't immediately embraced into the larger Indian community. And that also ends up being problematic in many ways as a very deeply Hindu culture community in the diaspora, where it's about congregating around festivals and Hindu moments and in very conventional family structures, right? And so we were uncomfortable in those family structures, and I decided that he himself said, my son said, that he wasn't very comfortable, and so we kind of existed on the margins of that, with loving it and embracing some aspects of it, but not necessarily steeping ourselves into some sense of like a shared deep Hindu culture, right? So I was definitely walking away from those, but also tapping back into some aspects of it, like the goddesses. That's a whole chapter about goddesses and the stories of mythology that I really enjoyed, but needed to twist and make them work for my own benefit, and lean into the feminist aspects of those rather than the problematic patriarchal ones. And so I was definitely doing this thing where I was constructing a different identity that pulled from some of the more beautiful, powerful aspects of my culture, and its celebration of motherhood, while also rejecting its non-celebration of, or its frowning upon those who choose not to be mothers or cannot be mothers, right? I don't think of motherhood as some sort of elevated form of womanhood. It's a very problematic notion. But insofar as I was a mother, I enjoyed those certain aspects of it. And so the American motherhood part of it was definitely this ability to live as an independent woman and not be considered, not have the whispering of aunties or the constant reminders of like my unmarried or divorced status, and twice divorced even, my goodness, right? And which is not to say that there aren't women who have made those choices living in India, but I do feel that here I was able to pick and choose and sort of construct a different kind of identity, where I didn't feel minimized, say, by family or extended family. So I think I was my son's mother, right? So what is my son's upbringing calling for at that time, right? The other thing I would say is that I had to mother myself in the past few years, especially. Mothering myself had become really important because my own mother was very uncomfortable with me calling out my brother's violence and stopped talking to me. And it has been a relief to have that happen. And it's been such a joy to mother myself and to say, what if I were my own daughter? What if this little girl needed a mother as much as my son had needed his mother? And so in that mothering of myself, I'm happy to report I'm really thriving, And so I encourage every woman to turn that mothering upon herself as well.
I want to stay on this aspect of mothering. And I often think of my son, as much as I'm raising him, he raises me as a feminist mother also. How has this book then transformed you as a feminist mother? And if you can elaborate on the journey you took in evolving your feminist vision through this book.
Lovely. I definitely think, as I was writing the book and looking at the title, I started to realize that at a certain point, I was raising a feminist son, but the spotlight moved from raising to feminist son. The fact that this is a feminist son and I have to raise him. He's already a feminist. So what does that mean? It means part of him raising me to be a feminist mom, where I think of this time where he's nudged me into being a better feminist. Say I was driving and I saw someone and I said, "Oh, is that a man or a woman?" And he said, "Oh, it's a person. Do you see a person?" And I said, "Yes, I see a person." And then those little moments of like pushing my feminism into newer spaces and recognizing that I have to be in solidarity with more and more different kinds of feminism, and it's only making feminism richer, right? So and in many other ways where he, in the final chapter, I talk about this episode where I'm kind of teasing him about flirting with a waitress, and he says, "No, these servers, these women get hit on a lot, and it would be so problematic. She's at the workplace, and if I were flirting with her, that would be a big problematic, harassment thing." And I'd never thought that way, right? And there were other moments where he stood up for me with my mother, and he stood up for me with myself, where I was talking about forgiveness and about forgiving my brother, and he said, "Well, not until he's asked for your forgiveness. You should wait for an apology." So, in pushing me to be a better feminist for myself and for others around us, I definitely think that was the raising of a feminist mother, and the raising that I was doing was of an already formed feminist after a while. And that kind of solidarity just becomes just incredible gift. And then, yes, while writing the book, being able to look back at these episodes and saying like, yeah, I hope that, in writing these, people will be able to see, and, as they read it, to be able to chart their own progress or their own trajectory with their kids and with their sons, and see where maybe their sons are calling to them to be feminists. At least that's my dream, Amrita.
You call your book a memoir, which it is, and a manifesto, but very quickly for readers, and I felt it too, there's this enormous breadth of research, tedious research that has gone into it. You have worked with psychologists, scholars, feminist scholars, parents from various cultural backdrops. What are some of the most important or intersecting elements that emerged as you researched the book in terms of motherhood, notions of masculinity, and being a feminist?
Yeah, I definitely found that there were so many things I still had to learn, right? Because that's the parts of my lived experience as a feminist were limited to my own, either my scholarship or my raising of my son and my own experiences. So, for instance, talking to Black mothers and mothers of Black sons, it's a very different fear that their motherhood is definitely shrouded in certain fears that I don't necessarily have to feel at the same scale. Of course, I feel it as raising a brown son in America. But talking to Dalit women for the Indian edition, I've gone deeper into caste and talked to Dalit feminists, and seeing my own complicity as a Brahmin woman raised in a Brahmin family, really questioning Brahmin patriarchy and how much I am definitely a product of it, or I benefited from it, and also a victim of it, where there's that brutal Brahmin patriarchy that rained blows upon my own body. And then seeing like, oh my goodness, and we were not necessarily raised to stand in solidarity with Dalit women who have been Me Tooing us for years and saying for years that, talking about rape and how they are policed and so learning all of that was really important for me, and to include those voices was really important to me, and has been such an educational experience. And then talking to psychologists, for instance, this psychologist saying that, I talk about how I started to talk to my son when he was 14 or 15 about my own Me Too, or issues with sexual harassment and sexual assault, so that he's aware of what society does and what his place is as a man. And later, when I talked to a psychologist, she said, if you don't cultivate that language, then it can feel a little sudden, right? So I use that as a tip, like, do it differently from what I did, speak to the feminists, find the right language, find the right moments in which to raise these things. So I think all of those only brought these greater intersections, talking to trans feminists and feminists raising LGBTQ kids, talking to a white father raising white sons, and talking about that, as a feminist man, where might he be feeling? What kinds of privilege does he need to talk to his boys about? So all of that just kind of I felt it was a gift that these people were all sharing their experiences with me, and then also that I'm able to take that and give that as a gift to readers as well, to see themselves all mirrored as much as possible. I mean, I feel awful if I've left someone out, but to see a cross section of feminists across intersections, see themselves reflected in there, and be able to take it forward from there.
My next question goes back again to tease out what feminism means. And it may sound basic in its premise, but it is still so problematic to me and many of us, and yet so important to talk about. Feminism is still the suspicious trope around us, both in America and in India, both contexts that I'm familiar with, and even in Sweden right now, where I'm speaking from, where we're really not post-gender or post-race. Well-meaning women shy away from being called a feminist, let alone, as you mentioned, you've been getting those phone calls to raise a feminist son. Sounds too radical, as you stated. I am also reminded, recently you had an NPR interview and then you got trolled, I believe, on some of the comments on the interview. When feminism has increasingly become a buzzword, and we find it, in T-shirts, on cards, anywhere. Not necessarily sometimes a bad thing, but so wrongly defined or represented in many contexts. Why do you think there's still so much suspicion around it? We are in 2021. And what can one do to clarify it is not just for women, as you mentioned this in so many different ways in the book? It is equally important for boys and men.
Yeah, I think of what Ijoma Oluo said at my book launch, where she was, we laughed about how not everyone is on board, right? And she said, like, yes, there's a target market for these books, right? But beyond the book, right? Beyond the product of the book, but in terms of an idea, not everyone is going to come along. And the thing is that we're not going to try and convince everyone, because it may take a while for everyone to see the benefit for their families, right? Or for their own kids and for themselves. But the huge resistance to it is centuries old, right? We refuse to learn the language, adopt the lens, and have the love. So the language, lens, and love for women, unconditional love for women, somehow we still resist that, whether it is men or women or just across gender, across all cultures and countries. We have been very suspicious of women. We think of them as manipulative, as something that would be out of control, as to be policed. Their sexuality is to be policed. They are to be feared. They are to be hated. There's so much of all of that, right? So how can we expect that, in the, say, 40 years or so that we've had the word, or 50 years, how many years? I don't know, more than that, that the word feminist has been around, that cultures will just adopt those, or say, yes, let's do this, right? Because there's so much of capitalism, there's so much tied in with women and control and, inheritance and all of those things. So of course there will be resistance. In my more compassionate moments, I think about, you mentioned like a lot of women to resisting the word, right? Mm. I think so much of that can be a coping mechanism because there's such a fear of change. As I said, I wanted to run back and just be at home and not, this calling of journalism and everything. I just wanted to reject that and say, no, I'm just a scared little girl and I just want to be home. And that felt so comfortable because, in some ways, but then when you start to see how, no, that's not where you are thriving, right? Then you begin to, disarm yourself of this role as a foot soldier of patriarchy as a woman. And you say, no, this coping mechanism, or what I think of as a coping mechanism, is not working for me. And I'm trying to intellectualize. We have a lot of people who try to intellectualize or base it in some philosophical thing of humanism and, oh no, we shouldn't be doing, I've seen all those things. And I feel like I understand that some, that it can be, and I'm not being condescending when I say this. I know that I was part of that as well in my early years, right? That seeing it as a coping mechanism, we need a lot of healing. We need a lot of therapy. We need a lot of examination of why we cannot believe women when they say they were raped or there was violence against them. Why would we say that? Why would a woman, of course, there are a very minuscule number of cases that a woman would be lying. And, we have the history of Emmett Till and things like that. It can be weaponized, but most of the time it isn't. But we see that as some sort of a way that women are being manipulative. Now, when it comes to boys in particular, as I said before, like, if we love women, right, for not just the women that deserve our love or deserve protection because they've been good women, right, but all women living their lives on their own terms, having agency over their lives, if we have love and respect for those women, then womanhood itself, or whatever feminine values are what we consider to be feminine values, we will let our boys also be part of that, right? And embrace that and say, that is not suspicious. That is not weaker. You don't throw like a girl or, cry like a girl or whatever. Crying is a healthy thing, being able to call your buddy and say, I'm sad today. Can you hang out with me? My son is able to do that, and he doesn't think it's weird. And what a gift to give to our boys, to be able to ask for help, to ask for directions, to ask for someone's compassion, to ask for company, to ask someone to hold them, to be able to fail and to learn to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I messed up. I want to do better. I can do wrong. I don't have to always be right. That is such a gift to our sons. So why not embrace feminism? That is what feminism is. Walk toward that kind of feminism. You don't like the word, just practice it. Don't even use the word, right? So, yeah.
You have a section in the book on race as well as caste, as you mentioned in the Indian edition. Two very important topics in their intersection with gender and inequality. How did race and caste have an impact on your parenting, your son? You mentioned about being on the margins of the diaspora in some ways, raising a brown American young man. And related to that, you mentioned the idea of raising your son with a vulnerable masculinity, and I think you just explained all of that. Can you talk about how race and caste had an impact on your raising your son?
Yeah. Well, for caste especially, so, my family, even though we were not raised very Hindu or Brahmin, that is a privilege that you're ensconced in that, right? Your last name alerts people to your caste and your place in society, and you walk with a certain swagger in the world, right? So I definitely had that in my upbringing, whether I recognized it or not. and had certain privileges. We didn't have money, but we had the upper caste privilege. And it opens doors upon doors in India in ways that people are not acknowledging even now, right? So having that privilege and seeing that sense of entitlement and the brutality that it can encourage, right? Like hitting your servant, for instance, the word servant itself, right? Being able to shout at them and order them around and feel a sense of entitlement upon a human being's body, right? Who knows what horrible things have been done by, my own ancestors. And I would see it even in my lifetime, right? I would see that. And then whatever, if someone is oppressing the maid or any person that's working in the family, you're going to be oppressed as well. You're not in some sort of exalted or exempt status. And as I was beaten, and it was considered discipline, right? And so I didn't want my son to be raised in that, and to be raised in that with that sense of entitlement, with that sense of cachet in the world. And even though I married outside a Brahmin caste, I didn't marry a Brahmin. His father is not a Brahmin, but he would be, by association, he would have those benefits, right? The English speaking, urban, Bombay raised, grandson of an army officer, and, father in advertising, mother in journalism. Those privileges of caste and class, he would definitely have those. And he would have been a very different young man, in spite of those things are so thick in the air. I know that he would have been different. Here he's a brown skinned man, and so he's going with a lack of privilege in some ways, right? In some ways, of course, we have certain privilege. I mean, not money as a journalism professor, but he has those disadvantages. But as I say in the book, raising him to be a feminist would be easier while we are among the oppressed rather than the oppressor. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it just for effect. I think that is what I chose at a certain point, where I was wondering whether to go back home or not. And now he's going to be 26, and I ask him often. And even though he says, yeah, it would have been nice to have extended family, and that, there were times of just loneliness, but being able to identify as someone within the struggle for racial justice and economic justice and gender justice in the US, that is a much richer life than anything that he could have had in India, right? So he's had a racist events, and I describe them in the book, where he's been in danger as a brown-skinned boy and a brown-skinned young man. And it's a prayer of mine that feminism recognizes those vulnerabilities of our boys and our men, that white feminists recognize that. And I say that, I've raised my son to stand in solidarity with women and with other people who are exploited because of their gender. And I want those people to stand in solidarity with my boy when it comes to him being a boy of color or a young man of color. So, yeah.
I want to wrap up with a little manifesto part of the book. If you had to, and each chapter, I highly encourage readers to look for the to-dos. I really enjoyed that. If you had to tell our viewers two most important things in raising children as feminists, what would they be, and how can parents implement them?
Two, huh? Amrita, you're just allowing me two. Okay. I would say, as a family, discuss what feminist values mean to you, right? First, do that. And use those values as a lens or a screen, right? We do strategic planning at the university, and we have this thing called a strategy screen, with which any decision that's to be made, we put it through that screen, right? It could be like 2 or 3 ways of looking at something. How does this affect the whole family? How does it affect the women in the family? Does this dismantle structures, or am I exploiting certain structures? Whatever it may be. If you adopt that value system as a family and adopt that way of seeing, of decision making, of even simple things like where are you going to dinner, like who's the person that's making those decisions, or who gets to have a vacation, or who gets to put up their feet at the end of the day, and who has to rush into the kitchen, right? Every little thing. If you adopt that value system, then you will be making individual change, and then of course the larger thing is to have political and change that changes structures, right? So to be thinking of like starting with those value systems within the family and seeing like how do we take this out into the larger whole. And then the second thing is more just personal, which is let your boys be tenderhearted, let them be sweet, fight every toxic masculinity comes at them hard, and just really wants to snatch them, and just like fight it and let them hold on to their sweetness, let them cry, let them be considered mama's boy, whatever that phrase means. Let them go tattoo mama or mom on their shoulders or their arms if they want, whatever. It's not like my son has done that, but if he did, I would encourage him. But just do that, and I think the rest sort of falls into place, because if they are sweet and have empathy, encourage empathy, if they have empathy, then they don't have to weigh everything. It becomes a muscle that just kicks into place when it comes to fighting for liberation and fighting for other people's lives.
Thank you so much, Sonora, for this fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for your great questions, Amrita. Such a pleasure talking to you.